The year is 1925 in the Soviet Union. A young Orthodox priest named Pavel stands in the doorway of his village church, watching as government officials approach with hammers and crowbars. His hands shake not from fear, but from a question that haunts him. What happens to a people when you tear away their faith? Within hours, the golden domes would be stripped, the icons burned, and the bells that had rung for centuries would be melted down for industrial metal. Pavel didn't know it then, but he was witnessing the beginning of one of history's most ambitious experiments, the systematic attempt to erase Christianity from an entire nation. But this isn't just a story about Russia. From the mountains of Albania to the rice fields of China, from the boulevards of revolutionary France to the streets of modern-day Western Europe, we've seen this pattern repeat itself across centuries and continents. And the result? They're far more complex and disturbing than you might imagine. Let me take you back further to the year 1789. Paris is burning with revolutionary fervor. The magnificent Notre Dame Cathedral, which had stood for 6 centuries as the spiritual heart of France, was about to become something entirely different. On November 10, 1793, revolutionary forces stormed through its ancient doors and declared it the Temple of Reason. They crowned a young actress as the Goddess of Reason and paraded her through the nave where countless Christians had been baptized, married, and mourned. The revolutionaries believed they were liberating France from superstition. They had no idea they were unleashing forces that would consume their own movement. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the layers of history that textbooks often skim over. If you find value in these deep dives into our past, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It genuinely helps us continue this work. The French Revolution's war on Christianity wasn't subtle. Priests were forced to marry or face execution. Churches were converted into warehouses, stables, and ammunition dumps. The revolutionary calendar eliminated Sundays and replaced Christian holidays with festivals honoring abstract concepts. Robespierre himself established the cult of the Supreme Being, attempting to create a rational religion to replace Christianity. The result? Within months, France descended into the Reign of Terror. Over 40,000 people were executed. The revolutionaries began devouring their own as accusations of insufficient revolutionary zeal led to the guillotine. Robespierre himself would end up under the blade. Now, you might argue this was just political chaos, not specifically caused by the removal of Christianity. But here's what's fascinating. When Napoleon came to power, one of his first major acts was the Concordat of 1801, re-establishing the Catholic Church in France. He understood something the revolutionaries had missed. As Napoleon allegedly said, society cannot exist without inequality of fortunes, and inequality of fortunes cannot exist without religion. Whether you agree with his cynicism or not, he recognized that the church had provided social cohesion, moral education, and community structure that the state struggled to replace. But let's jump forward to a much larger and more systematic experiment. The Soviet Union didn't just want to diminish Christianity's influence. They wanted to eliminate it entirely. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, Russia was one of the most Christian nations on earth, with over 50,000 Orthodox churches and 150,000 priests and monks. By 1941, only a few hundred churches remained open, and the number of active priests had dropped to barely 6,000. The persecution was methodical and brutal. In 1922, Lenin personally ordered the confiscation of church valuables, stating in a secret letter that the greater the number of representatives of the reactionary clergy and reactionary bourgeoisie we succeed in executing, the better. The NKVD kept meticulous records. Between 1917 and 1935, approximately 130,000 Orthodox priests were arrested. Of these, 95,000 were executed. The rest died in labor camps. But here's where it gets interesting. The Soviets didn't just persecute, they tried to replace Christianity with scientific atheism and communist ideology. They created the League of Militant Atheists, which at its peak claimed 3.5 million members. They established anti-religious museums in former churches, including the famous Museum of the History of Religion in Leningrad, housed in the Kazan Cathedral. They promoted science and rational thinking as the antidote to religious superstition. So what happened? Did Soviet society become more rational, more peaceful, more equitable without Christianity? The answer is complicated. The Soviet Union achieved remarkable scientific advances. They put the first satellite and first human in space. They achieved near universal literacy. They created a superpower from a largely agrarian society. But at what cost? The numbers are staggering. Historian Robert Conquest estimates that between 1917 and 1953, the Soviet regime killed approximately 20 million of its own citizens through executions, man-made famines, and the Gulag system. The Holodomor, Stalin's forced famine in Ukraine in 1932-33, killed between 3.5 and 5 million people. Was this because Christianity disappeared? Not directly. But consider this. The moral framework that once declared human life sacred, that provided concepts of mercy and forgiveness, that offered community support and charity, all of this was systematically dismantled. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived the Gulag, wrote extensively about what happened to Soviet society. In The Gulag Archipelago, he observed that when people lost their faith, they also lost their internal moral compass. Without the belief in divine judgment or eternal consequences, without the Christian emphasis on the inherent worth of every human soul, it became easier for individuals to betray neighbors, for bureaucrats to implement murderous policies, for guards to torture prisoners. But here's the twist in the story. Christianity didn't actually disappear, it went underground. Babushkas, grandmothers, secretly baptized children. Priests served in labor camps conducting clandestine services. Icons were hidden in walls. And when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, Orthodox Christianity came roaring back. Today, over 70% of Russians identify as Orthodox Christian. Thousands of churches have been rebuilt. What does this tell us? That faith, once deeply rooted in a culture, is extraordinarily difficult to eradicate completely. Let's shift to a different kind of experiment. Albania under Enver Hoxha. In 1967, Albania declared itself the world's first officially atheist state. Article 37 of the 1976 Constitution stated, "The state recognizes no religion and supports atheistic propaganda in order to implant a scientific, materialistic world outlook in people." Every church, mosque, and religious institution was closed. Over 2,000 religious buildings were destroyed or converted to other uses. Practicing religion, even privately, could result in 10 years in prison. Albania became a hermit kingdom, isolated from both East and West. Hoxha's paranoia led to the construction of over 700,000 concrete bunkers across the small nation, preparing for invasions that never came. The economy stagnated. By the time communism fell in 1991, Albania was Europe's poorest nation. Again, was this caused by the absence of Christianity specifically? It's impossible to prove direct causation. But when the restrictions lifted, religious practice resumed almost immediately, suggesting that the forced atheism had created a spiritual vacuum that people rushed to fill. Now, before you think this is just about communist regimes, let's talk about something happening right now in Western Europe. Christianity isn't being forcibly removed. It's simply fading away. In the United Kingdom, less than 1% of young adults identify as practicing Anglicans. Churches are being converted into nightclubs, apartments, and bookstores at an unprecedented rate. The Church of England is closing approximately 20 churches per year. In the Netherlands, 2 churches close every week. In Germany, despite a church tax that provides funding, both Catholic and Protestant churches are seeing mass exodus. What's replacing Christianity in these societies? Not state atheism or militant anti-religion, but a combination of secularism, individualism, and what some scholars call moralistic therapeutic deism. A vague belief in being nice and feeling good about yourself. British philosopher Roger Scruton observed before his death that as Christianity faded from British life, certain social bonds weakened. Church attendance had provided regular community interaction across class lines. It had given people a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. It had marked the rhythm of life, baptisms, weddings, funerals. Here's a sobering statistic. In the UK, loneliness has been declared a public health crisis. A 2017 study found that over 9 million Britons report feeling lonely frequently or always. The government actually appointed a minister for loneliness. Is this directly caused by Christianity's decline? Not solely, of course. Modern life, technology, urbanization, and changing work patterns all contribute. But consider that churches were once the primary community hub outside of family and work. Their decline has left a vacuum. Quick question for you. Where are you watching this from, and how has the religious landscape changed in your lifetime? Drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious about your experiences. Let's examine China, where Christianity has faced multiple waves of suppression. During the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, Red Guards destroyed churches, burned Bibles, and persecuted Christians. Christianity was portrayed as a foreign imperialist tool. Yet today, despite continued government restrictions, China has an estimated 100 million Christians, making it home to one of the largest Christian populations in the world. The Chinese government, while officially atheist, has noticed something interesting. Christian communities tend to have lower crime rates, stronger family structures, and higher social trust. This brings us to a critical question that scholars debate intensely. What is the relationship between Christianity and Western civilization? Historian Tom Holland, himself an atheist for most of his life, wrote an entire book called Dominion, arguing that even secular Western values, human rights, equality, care for the weak, the concept of progress, are fundamentally Christian in origin. He points out that ancient Rome saw mercy as weakness and compassion as contemptible. The strong dominated the weak, and this was considered natural. Christianity revolutionized ethics by insisting that the last shall be first, that the powerful should serve the powerless, that every human being has inherent dignity. Nietzsche understood this. When he declared, "God is dead," he wasn't celebrating. He was terrified. He predicted that the death of Christian faith in Europe would lead to nihilism and eventually to catastrophic violence as new ideologies rushed to fill the void. He wrote this in the 1880s. Decades later, Europe would experience 2 world wars, the Holocaust, and totalitarian regimes that killed tens of millions. Let me tell you about a village in Russia that illustrates something profound. In 1931, the village of Kargopol in northern Russia had 17 churches. All were closed or destroyed. The population was about 3,000. By 1991, the population had declined to under 10,000, despite being a regional center, and social problems, alcoholism, domestic violence, suicide, were endemic. In the 1990s, one church was restored and reopened. A small Orthodox community reformed. Social workers and local officials noticed something remarkable. Families who became involved with the church showed measurably better outcomes. Alcoholism rates dropped. Children's school attendance improved. This wasn't a scientific study, just local observation, but it's been replicated across Russia. Why does this happen? One theory is that religious communities provide several things simultaneously: a moral framework, social accountability, regular communal gathering, a sense of meaning and purpose, and practical support networks. When you remove religion, you have to replace all of these functions separately, and that's incredibly difficult. Let's look at Scandinavia, often cited as proof that secular societies can thrive. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway are among the least religious countries in Europe, with church attendance often below 5%. Yet they have low crime rates, strong social trust, and high quality of life. Doesn't this contradict everything I've been saying? Not quite. Here's what's interesting. These countries still have state churches. Christianity is taught in schools as cultural heritage. The Lutheran work ethic and social values still permeate the culture. The societies are secular, but they're built on Christian foundations. As Dutch philosopher Theo Hobson puts it, they're living off Christian capital, the accumulated social and moral infrastructure built over centuries of Christian dominance. The real question is, how long can this last? Some sociologists argue that we're seeing a slow-motion collapse of social trust and cohesion in these countries as the Christian cultural memory fades. Others argue that secular humanism can maintain these values without religious underpinning. We're watching a live experiment, and the results won't be clear for decades. Here's a case study that should fascinate you. East versus West Germany. For 40 years, East Germany was officially atheist, while West Germany remained largely Christian. When reunification happened in 1990, researchers had a natural experiment. Genetically similar people, shared history, but different religious trajectories. Today, Eastern Germany remains far less religious than Western Germany, with over 70% claiming no religious affiliation compared to about 40% in the West. But here's what's intriguing. Eastern Germany has lower marriage rates, higher divorce rates, and higher rates of depression and suicide. Again, correlation doesn't prove causation, but the pattern is worth noting. Let me share a personal story that illuminates something important. In 2019, I interviewed a woman named Irina who grew up in Leningrad during the 1970s. She was raised in a committed atheist household. Her father was a party member, her mother a school teacher. They mocked religious people as backwards. But Irina told me something unexpected. She said, "We had no framework for processing suffering. When my brother died in an accident, we had no ritual, no community, no meaning to assign to his death. We were just supposed to be strong and move forward. I envied my religious classmates who had prayers, who believed their loved ones went to a better place, who had churches where people gathered to mourn together." This touches on something often overlooked in discussions about religion: its role in helping humans cope with suffering, mortality, and meaninglessness. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that humans need meaning to survive, perhaps even more than they need comfort. For millennia, Christianity provided that meaning structure. What happens when it disappears? Some people turn to other meaning systems: political ideologies, nationalism, consumerism, self-help movements, social justice activism. None of these are inherently bad, but historian Michael Burley has argued that when political ideologies try to fill the religion-shaped hole in human culture, they tend to become totalitarian. They demand total commitment. They divide the world into righteous and unrighteous. They promise salvation through collective action. Both Nazism and communism had religious characteristics: sacred texts, orthodoxy, heretics, martyrs, and the promise of paradise, whether the thousand-year Reich or the communist utopia. Let's talk about something rarely discussed: the role of Christian charity and social services. In Rome, during the plague of 260 AD, Christians became famous for staying in cities to care for the sick while pagans fled. This wasn't altruism alone. They believed suffering had meaning and that serving others was serving Christ. Fast forward to today, when you remove Christian organizations from social services, who fills the gap? In many cases, government programs take over. But here's an interesting statistic. Religious charities tend to operate more efficiently and with higher volunteer engagement than secular equivalents. A 2013 study by MIT economists found that religious communities in the United States contribute approximately $1.2 trillion annually in economic value through charity, education, healthcare, and other services. When Christianity declines in a nation, this contribution shrinks. Consider the Philippines versus South Korea. In 1960, both were poor, war-torn countries. The Philippines was overwhelmingly Catholic, South Korea predominantly Buddhist with growing Christian minorities. South Korea industrialized rapidly and is now wealthy, while the Philippines, despite economic growth, struggled with corruption and inequality. But here's the twist. South Korea's Christian population grew from 2% in 1950 to about 30% today, and Christian churches became major providers of education and social services. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the Catholic Church's power declined as governments secularized. This isn't a simple more Christianity equals more prosperity equation. South Korea's success had many factors, but it shows that Christianity's role in national development is complex. What about morality? Can people be moral without Christianity? Of course they can. There are ethical atheists and immoral Christians. But here's the deeper question. Can a society maintain moral consensus without a shared transcendent source? Philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre argues that modern secular societies have incoherent ethical systems because they've inherited Christian moral intuitions, care for the poor, human equality, universal human rights, but rejected the metaphysical foundations that made those intuitions logical. In Christian theology, humans have dignity because they're created in God's image. Remove God, and why should we believe in inherent human dignity? Secular humanism provides answers, but MacIntyre argues they're less robust. Here's a concrete example: the concept of human rights. Where do rights come from? The American Declaration of Independence says we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. This grounds rights in something beyond human preference. Secular philosophers have struggled to provide equally firm foundations. Utilitarian ethics says rights exist because they maximize happiness. But this means rights can be overridden if doing so produces greater happiness. Social contract theory says rights exist by agreement, but this means they only apply within communities that agree to them. I'm not arguing that atheists can't believe in human rights or act morally. They obviously can and do. But I'm pointing out that when Christianity disappears from a nation, certain philosophical foundations shift, and this has consequences we're still working out. Let's examine education. Medieval European universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Bologna, were all founded by the Church. The concept of universal education arose from the Protestant Reformation's emphasis on every person reading the Bible. Christian missionaries established schools worldwide. When Christianity's influence in education declines, what changes? Some argue that education becomes more scientific and rational. Others argue it becomes more fragmented, lacking a coherent vision of human purpose and flourishing. In the United States, as Christianity's role in public education has declined since the mid-20th century, there's been an ongoing culture war about what should replace it. Whose values should schools teach? How should they address questions of meaning and purpose? There's no consensus, which leads to constant political battles. Now let me share something that might surprise you. Not every society where Christianity declined experienced catastrophe. Japan has never been predominantly Christian, and it's a highly functional, ethical society with low crime and strong social cohesion. This is grounded in Confucian values, Shinto traditions, and Buddhist ethics. What this suggests is that the removal of Christianity is devastating, specifically in societies where Christianity had been the primary source of moral formation and social cohesion. You can't remove the foundation from a building without consequences, even if other buildings use different foundations. The question isn't whether non-Christian societies can function. They obviously can. But what happens when you remove Christianity from a historically Christian society? You're not creating a neutral space. You're creating a vacuum that will be filled by something else. Let's talk about art and culture. Some of humanity's greatest artistic achievements, Bach's Masses, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, Dante's Divine Comedy, Dostoevsky's novels, were deeply Christian. As Christianity fades, does artistic inspiration change? Many modern artists and critics argue that religious art was constrained by doctrine, and that secular art is more free and authentic. Others argue that Christianity provided depth, meaning, and transcendent reference points that modern art often lacks. Roger Scruton argued that the loss of Christian sacred music left a void in Western culture. He pointed out that people still flock to performances of Handel's Messiah or Mozart's Requiem, even in highly secular societies, because something in these works speaks to deep human longings that contemporary secular culture doesn't address. Here's a fascinating detail. When the Soviet Union suppressed Christianity, they also suppressed Christian art and music. Rachmaninoff's All-Night Vigil, one of the masterpieces of choral music, couldn't be performed publicly. When the Soviet Union fell, there was a renaissance of Orthodox sacred music. Russian musicians described it as reclaiming part of their cultural soul. Let me tell you about a study that shocked many researchers. Harvard sociologists, including some who are not religious, found that children raised in religious households with regular church attendance showed significantly better outcomes on numerous measures: higher academic achievement, better mental health, lower rates of drug use, lower rates of teen pregnancy, and higher rates of volunteering and civic engagement. The effect persisted even after controlling for income, education, and other factors. Why? The researchers hypothesized that regular religious practice provides structure, community, clear values, and a sense of purpose during the turbulent teenage years. This doesn't mean religious upbringing is perfect or that secular parenting fails. Many secular families provide excellent child rearing, but it suggests that when religious practice declines across an entire society, these benefits also decline on a societal level. What profession are you in, by the way? I'm curious whether these historical patterns resonate with what you see in your own field. Let me know in the comments. Let's return to France, where we started. After the French Revolution's attempt to eliminate Christianity failed, France underwent cycles of secularization and religious revival. Today, France is one of Europe's most secular nations. The 1905 law on the separation of church and state established strict secularism in public life. Church attendance is under 5%. Yet something interesting is happening. There's been a resurgence of interest in France's Christian heritage. Notre Dame's devastating fire in 2019 triggered an outpouring of grief and a determination to rebuild that surprised many observers. Why? Because even secular French people recognize the cathedral as essential to French identity. This points to something important: cultural memory. Even when religious practice declines, the cultural imprint of Christianity remains for generations. It's in the architecture, the calendar, the legal concepts, the art, the literature, the social assumptions. The philosopher Charles Taylor calls this the social imaginary, the set of assumptions about reality that people in a society share, often unconsciously. In historically Christian societies, much of the social imaginary is Christian-shaped, even for non-believers. But Taylor also warns that this cultural memory fades. Each generation that grows up without religious practice has a weaker connection to the Christian cultural heritage. Eventually, the connection severs entirely. When that happens, the society fundamentally changes in ways that are difficult to predict. Let me share one more story that brings this home. In 2015, I visited a village in northern England where the medieval church had been converted into luxury apartments. It was beautifully done. The stained glass preserved, the architecture respected. But something struck me as I stood there. For over 800 years, this building had been where villagers gathered weekly, where they celebrated, mourned, sought comfort, and found community. Now it was private residences. The villagers no longer had a gathering place. The pub had closed years earlier due to economic changes. The community center had limited hours and funding. Where did people gather now? Mostly they didn't. One elderly resident told me, "We've lost something we can't quite name. People used to know their neighbors." There was a rhythm to life: Sunday services, church festivals, community events. Now everyone's isolated in their own houses, staring at screens. This is anecdotal, not data, but it illustrates something important about what can disappear when Christianity fades. Not just belief in God, but the entire social infrastructure built around that belief. Let's address some counter-arguments. Many people argue that Christianity has caused tremendous harm throughout history. The Crusades, the Inquisition, colonialism, oppression of women and minorities, resistance to science. These criticisms aren't wrong. Christianity, when wielded as a tool of power, has indeed caused suffering. But here's the nuance. The question isn't whether Christianity has always been beneficial, but what happens specifically when it disappears from a society where it's been dominant. The alternative to Christian society isn't automatically better. The 20th century's bloodiest regimes, Stalin's USSR, Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Hitler's Germany, were all explicitly anti-Christian or attempted to subordinate Christianity to the state. The death toll from these regimes dwarfs the deaths from religious wars in earlier centuries. This doesn't make Christianity's historical crimes acceptable. It means we should be careful about assuming that removing Christianity automatically improves societies. Here's another important point. Christianity itself contains resources for self-criticism and reform. The prophetic tradition, Jesus' teachings about hypocrisy and loving enemies, Paul's insistence that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female in Christ. These became tools for reform movements. The abolitionist movement was largely Christian. The civil rights movement was led by Christian clergy. Yes, other Christians defended slavery and segregation, but the reformers used Christian principles to challenge them. When Christianity disappears, these internal resources for moral reform also disappear. What replaces them? Sometimes nothing. Sometimes new ideologies that lack Christianity's self-critical elements. I want to address something sensitive but important. Many people leave Christianity because of personal hurt, intellectual doubts, or moral disagreement with church teachings. These are valid reasons. Individual choices about faith are deeply personal. But individual choices and societal-level changes are different. A person can leave Christianity and build a meaningful, ethical life. But when Christianity disappears from an entire society, the effects are broader and more complex. Let me bring us toward a conclusion by returning to Russia. When communism fell and Christianity returned, it wasn't a simple story of goodness triumphing. The Russian Orthodox Church became closely aligned with Putin's government. It's been criticized for blessing authoritarianism, condemning LGBTQ people, and supporting aggressive nationalism. This reminds us that Christianity's return doesn't automatically solve societal problems. The relationship between Christianity and political power is complex and often corrupting. So what's the answer? What should societies do about Christianity's decline? I'm not here to provide prescriptions. I'm a historian, not a preacher. But I can point out some patterns. Societies where Christianity has declined rapidly without developing alternative sources of community, meaning, and moral formation tend to struggle with nihilism, loneliness, and social fragmentation. Societies where Christianity declines gradually while other institutions maintain social cohesion tend to fare better. Societies where Christianity is violently suppressed tend to see it return when suppression ends. Perhaps the real lesson is this: humans need meaning, community, moral frameworks, and ways to process suffering. For 2,000 years, Christianity provided these for Western civilization, and increasingly for parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. When it disappears, something else must fill these needs. Sometimes that something is better, sometimes worse, and sometimes we don't know yet because the experiment is still ongoing. The question isn't really what happens when Christianity disappears from a nation. The question is, what replaces it, and can the replacement provide the same functions? History suggests the answer is complicated, varies by context, and often takes generations to fully understand. As we've walked through the ruins of French revolutionary churches, Soviet labor camps, Albanian bunkers, and English apartments that were once places of worship, one thing becomes clear. Christianity's disappearance from a nation isn't a simple liberation or a simple catastrophe. It's a profound transformation that touches every aspect of society: how people find meaning, how communities cohere, how morality is grounded, how suffering is processed, how art is created, and how the vulnerable are treated. Whether you see this transformation as progress or loss probably depends on your own beliefs. But regardless of what we believe, we're all living through it right now. In Western Europe, North America, Australia, and parts of Asia, Christianity is declining at unprecedented rates. We're witnesses to something historically rare: the voluntary abandonment of religious faith by societies that were shaped by it for over a millennium. The consequences will unfold over the coming decades and centuries. Perhaps secular humanism will prove capable of maintaining the values we cherish without religious foundations. Perhaps new forms of spirituality will emerge to fill the void. Perhaps Christianity will experience revival as it has before. Or perhaps something entirely unexpected will happen. History suggests we should watch carefully, act thoughtfully, and remain humble about our ability to predict how these massive transformations will ultimately play out.